Super Mario Bros. 3 was one of the most highly anticipated games of all time. After the massive success that was the original on the NES, a sequel was no doubt warranted. The world quickly fell in love with Mario, so much so, in fact, that before the game was even released in 1988, it was shown off in a movie titled The Wizard. This movie would give the world its first ever look into Mario's third mainline adventure, and this decision by Nintendo seemed to pay off quite well, as the hype for this game rose to heights never seen before once the audience got a glimpse of it for the first time. To this day, Super Mario Bros. 3 remains as one of the most popular and beloved entries in not only the Mario franchise, but in all of gaming. The newer generation has discovered countless ways to blast through the game as fast as possible, while the older generation views this game as a massive part of their childhood. Overall, Super Mario Bros. 3 would go on to create one of the most unique legacies in all of gaming. Its level of hype was unmatched at the time, and the slew of new ideas and mechanics introduced in this title form an experience that will forever be looked back on with admiration and respect. However, that's not to say everything about this game is perfect, as after recently playing through its entirety, I've noticed that there are certain areas which haven't aged quite as well as some might remember. So let's take a look at all the new things Super Mario Bros. 3 brought to the table, along with some of the more tedious attributes which also contribute to the experience at times. So right off the bat, Mario Bros. 3 does something no other entry in the series had done before or after this game's release. That of course being the fact that Super Mario Bros. 3 is actually a play. Shigeru Miyamoto himself even confirmed that the entire thing takes place on stage, which would explain why some of the platforms are bolted in, and how Mario runs offset upon reaching the end of a level. For a game released in the 80s, this is an incredibly cool detail which adds a ton of unique personality and charm to the experience. It kinda makes it feel like Mario isn't ever really in any danger since it's all just a play. Overall, this just brings in such a neat detail which only becomes more enjoyable if you have this knowledge throughout your playthrough. Another thing Mario Bros. 3 did before any other game in the franchise is introduce an overworld. Unlike before where you would automatically be taken into the next level, now you're brought to the world map upon completion. This opened up so much room for creativity and secrets, the likes which we'd never seen before. Each world has a completely distinct theme from one another, so including a world map gives the player a taste of what they'll be going up against next in such a brilliant way. I'll always be genuinely impressed with how much life the developers were able to stuff into these areas with such limited hardware at the time. Oh, and this creativity stretches far into the levels themselves as well. You never really know what's coming next, as one moment you could be running away from an angry sun, finding your way through a pipe maze, or even facing off against giant enemies. These concepts are all super innovative and far more interesting than what the modern games would provide us with decades later. And you want to talk about creative, just check out the power-ups on display here. Some of these we never even saw again. For example, there's the frog suit, which allows for swift movement through the water, thus enabling swimming to be a much more enjoyable experience. There's the hammer suit, which is my personal favorite. This allows you to throw a few hammers at a time, and you can defeat almost anything you see with this, even thwomps. Then there's the most famous power-up, the Super Leaf, which transforms Mario into a tanuki, and allows you to fly for a certain amount of time. This mechanic in and of itself can be manipulated to gain some crazy height and distance. If you learn how the Super Leaf works, then you'll no doubt find yourself blasting through levels, and to this day, this is one of the most exhilarating things you can do in a Mario game. These power-ups are all just so memorable and distinct, which gives you tons of freedom as to how you want to go about pursuing a certain level. Mario Bros. 3 introduced some of the most iconic Mario enemies into the franchise as well. This is most clearly seen with the Koopalings, who made their first ever appearance in this title. Now keep in mind that this was during a time where the Koopalings were a brand new concept, which just helped shape this game into an even more unique and refreshing experience. Each and every one of them is present here, and they're all pretty enjoyable to fight as well. They can be quite tricky, which is also something that can be said for Super Mario Bros. 3 as a whole. Yeah, this game is tough, really tough. It's far more difficult than any of the other classic games in my opinion, which depending on your stance could be a great thing or a bad thing. The difficulty also amps up fairly quickly as well. For the most part, I'd say this works towards the game's benefit, but there were times when I felt as though I died due to terrible enemy placements. This was most notably seen in the airship levels where the lack of vision due to them being auto-scrollers would more times than not result in me getting totally blindsided by a cannon or bomb. I'm also not a fan of when the game opts to create an artificial challenge by placing an abundance of enemies everywhere. It just feels cheap and unfair. Mario's movement is also a bit awkward and just feels off at times. He can be way too slippery, almost as if you're playing as Luigi, and if you don't have a power-up, he can be incredibly underpowered in specific areas. All this to say, I think the difficulty is overall pretty well balanced, but when the difficulty is substantially amped up, it is often due to poor enemy placement and blindside violations. However, one area Super Mario Bros. 3 absolutely excels at is its soundtrack. In my opinion, this was the first of the classic games to introduce multiple memorable themes as opposed to just one or two. There's the overworld themes, the athletic theme, the boss fight themes, among many others. I truly think the soundtrack is one of the biggest reasons Super Mario Bros. 3 still remains relevant all these years later. That and the fantastic gameplay, of course. Something I don't see much people talk about is the final fight with Bowser. This one's unique to the series, as you no longer have to run underneath him and hit the axe in order to defeat him. Rather, you need to fool Bowser into jumping in the same spot 3 different times so he falls to his doom. I found this to be a nice change of pace from what we usually get, but in all honesty, the lead up to this final battle is just frustrating. For some reason, Nintendo just loved to put mazes into their earlier Mario games, which only served to make things more of a nuisance rather than a genuinely enjoyable inclusion. Having to either look up a guide or stumble along until you eventually find your way is agitating and sucks all the fun out of the experience. It also feels like a lazy way of padding out the runtime of the game, and while the maze itself is not what I have a problem with, it's the way it's executed. The pipe maze world can be enjoyable, if not at least due to its unique setting and atmosphere, but the final world just throws you in the dark and requires you to fumble your way through every level in order to proceed. This is one area I'm glad Nintendo changed with their modern releases, as I don't know anyone who really enjoyed these more labyrinthian stages, especially when considering the time limit placed on your head throughout each and every level. Before wrapping it up, I want to take a moment to appreciate the enemies within Super Mario Bros. 3. I touched upon them briefly earlier, but these are genuinely some of the most outlandish and crazy baddies we've seen in the franchise. These guys just don't hold back either. They really are quite the chaotic bunch of minions. Some of them anger me a bit, but they all have really fluid and detailed animations, which, as I mentioned earlier, was super impressive considering the limitations of the hardware. This is also just a beautiful game in general, as you can tell it truly pushed the NES to its limits. It's mind-blowing to me that this is on the same console as the first Super Mario Bros. The difference in quality between these two titles is astounding, and just goes to show how smart Nintendo is when it comes to learning the ins and outs of their consoles. But in the end, Super Mario Bros. 3 will go down in history as one of the most revered video games of all time. It took an already blooming franchise and pushed it that much further into astonishing success. Its release brought the whole world together, as nobody wanted anything more than to get a taste of Mario's brand new adventure on their beloved NESs. This game and its build up to release should be studied by game developers until the end of time, as it really is one of the greatest examples of how to hype up an audience and truly deliver on that hype. Super Mario Bros. 3 may have its flaws, but overall, it truly is one of the greatest and most influential video games of all time. But that's gonna do it for this one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.